Female CEO falls asleep on a single dad's shoulder during a flight, but wakes up shocked when he... Sometimes the universe conspires to remind us that vulnerability isn't weakness, and that the walls we build to protect ourselves can become the very prisons that keep us from living. On a routine red-eye flight from Seattle to Boston, two strangers would discover that the most profound connections often happen when we're too exhausted to maintain our carefully constructed facades. Victoria Chen, a powerhouse CEO who had built her tech empire from nothing, was about to learn that success means nothing when you have no one to share it with. And Marcus Rodriguez, a widowed father barely holding his world together, would prove that true strength isn't about never falling apart. It's about showing up every single day despite being broken. If this story touches your heart, please hit that like button, drop a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to Kindness Pulse so you never miss a story that reminds us of our shared humanity. Your support means the world. Victoria hadn't slept properly in 3 weeks. The boardroom battles, the investor presentations, the endless stream of decisions that could make or break thousands of jobs, it had all taken its toll. At 38, she was at the pinnacle of her career, featured on magazine covers and invited to exclusive conferences, but she couldn't remember the last time she'd had a conversation that wasn't about quarterly projections or market share. Her assistant had booked her the first-class seat as always, a cocoon of luxury that felt increasingly like a gilded cage. She settled into 2A with her laptop, her phone, and her armor of designer clothes and perfect makeup, ready to work through another flight like she had hundreds of times before. Marcus slid into seat 2B with the apologetic energy of someone who knew he didn't quite belong in first class. The ticket had been a gift from his late wife's parents, who insisted he needed to treat himself for once. He was carrying a worn backpack covered in his daughter's stickers, and his eyes held the particular exhaustion of a parent who'd spent the morning getting a 6-year-old ready for a week with her grandparents, while managing his own grief and guilt about needing the break. He was a high school art teacher, and his paint-stained hands and simple clothes stood in stark contrast to Victoria's polished perfection. When their eyes met briefly, they exchanged the kind of polite, distant smile strangers give each other before retreating into their separate worlds. The flight took off into a turbulent night. Victoria tried to work, but her vision kept blurring, her head pounding with the kind of exhaustion that transcends physical tiredness and becomes something almost existential. She had trained herself to power through anything, but her body was finally staging a rebellion. As the cabin lights dimmed and the plane settled into its cruising altitude, she felt herself losing the battle against sleep. The last thing she remembered was her head tilting, searching for somewhere to rest and finding an unexpected softness. Marcus's shoulder. Marcus felt the weight of her head against him and froze. His first instinct was to wake her, to maintain the proper boundaries between strangers. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she looked so vulnerable in sleep. All the sharp edges of her corporate persona softened into something achingly human. Maybe it was because he understood bone-deep exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying too much for too long. Or maybe it was because his daughter Lily often fell asleep on his shoulder just like this, and the gesture felt like a reminder that beneath all our differences, we're all just people desperate for connection and rest. So he stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, holding the stranger's exhaustion as gently as he held his daughter's dreams. Victoria slept for 3 hours, the deepest, most restorative sleep she'd had in months. When she finally stirred awake, there was a moment of disoriented confusion before the horror of her situation crashed over her. She had drooled slightly on the stranger's shirt. Her carefully styled hair was a mess. Worse, she had been completely vulnerable, utterly without control. And the panic that brought was almost suffocating. She jerked upright, stammering apologies, her face burning with embarrassment. But Marcus just smiled, a real smile, warm and uncomplicated, and said something that would change the trajectory of her entire life. "It's okay. You looked like you needed it." Sometimes we all need permission to stop being strong for a minute. Those simple words cracked something open in Victoria. She found herself doing something she hadn't done in years. She started talking. Really talking. Not networking or strategizing, but actually sharing. Marcus told her about his wife Sarah, who had died 2 years ago from cancer, about how he was raising Lily alone while trying to honor his late wife's memory and not lose himself in the process. He spoke about the small moments that made life meaningful. His daughter's laughter, the way a perfect sunset looked, the satisfaction of helping a struggling student finally understand art. Victoria talked about the loneliness of success, about how she'd sacrificed every relationship for her career, and was starting to wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake. She talked about her immigrant parents who had worked in factories so she could go to college, and how their pride in her achievements somehow made her feel even more isolated, as if she couldn't admit that despite everything she'd accomplished, she felt hollow inside. They talked until the plane began its descent. Marcus showed her photos of Lily, gap-toothed and wild-haired and clearly the center of his universe. Victoria showed him the app her company had developed, explaining for the first time, not in terms of market disruption, but in terms of how it actually helped people connect. When the plane touched down, they lingered in their seats, neither wanting to break the spell. Finally, Marcus did something brave. He wrote his number on a napkin and handed it to her. "I don't know if successful CEOs have coffee with broke art teachers," he said with a self-deprecating laugh. "But if you ever want to talk to someone who won't ask you about quarterly earnings, I'm around." Victoria took the napkin, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something shift in her chest. Hope, maybe, or possibility. 3 months later, she would meet Lily, who would inform her matter-of-factly that she needed way more colors in her closet, and that work isn't as important as people. 6 months later, Victoria would restructure her role at the company, bringing in a co-CEO and finally implementing the work-life balance policies she'd always claimed to support, but never practiced. A year later, Marcus would paint a portrait of her laughing, really laughing at one of Lily's terrible jokes, and Victoria would realize she couldn't remember what her face looked like before she learned how to be this happy. And 2 years later, when they married in a small ceremony in Marcus's backyard with Lily as the flower girl, Victoria would think back to that flight and marvel at how the best things in life happen when we finally stop, trying to control everything and allow ourselves to fall, whether into sleep on a stranger's shoulder or into a love we never saw coming. If this story reminded you of what truly matters in life, please take a moment to like this video, share your own experiences in the comments below, and subscribe to Kindness Pulse. Every subscription helps us continue sharing stories that celebrate the beautiful, unexpected ways we find each other in this world. Thank you for being part of this community. The truth is, we spend so much of our lives building walls and wearing masks, convinced that vulnerability is weakness, and that asking for help is failure. But sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let ourselves fall asleep on a stranger's shoulder, trusting that the world might be kinder than we've learned to expect. Sometimes success isn't about climbing higher or working harder. It's about having the courage to admit we're tired and accepting that we don't have to carry everything alone. And sometimes the person who changes your life forever is the one sitting next to you in the midst of an ordinary moment, ready to remind you that beneath all our accomplishments and struggles and carefully constructed identities, we're all just human beings looking for someone who sees us, exhaustion and all, and chooses to stay anyway. Victoria and Marcus's story isn't about a fairy tale. Romance, it's about two broken people who found each other in the middle of their respective storms and discovered that healing doesn't mean fixing yourself alone. It means finding someone who will hold your exhaustion gently while you learn to rest, who will remind you that you're enough exactly as you are, and who will show you that the most extraordinary love often begins with the smallest act of unexpected kindness.